Hello and welcome to an all-new episode of Perspective right here on the CryptoCast Network. Thank you, ladies and gentlemen, so much for joining us yet again on another beautiful day to talk crypto. We have our link up here, cryptocast.network, where you'll be able to find our YouTube link, iTunes, Twitter, Instagram, and RSS feed. And of course, we have our merchandise for sale to support the channel. And we are, as always, we are displaying our QR code at the bottom, as this is a community-supported YouTube channel. So we appreciate every donation that we get. Thank you guys so much for that. And of course, we're still doing our programming with Bitcoin.com workshop, where we do an interactive 2-day workshop to teach C# developers how to integrate Bitcoin. And that is taught by both myself and the creator of the NBitcoin library, Nicolas Doyer. And we're trying to take that around the country to go to. First, we're going to be hitting San Francisco October 13th and Seattle November 3rd. We just finished up our Las Vegas workshop and had a great time there. So we hope to see you in San Francisco next. And with that aside, let's get into our article today. Let me stop the screen share and introduce our special guest. We have Mr. Dan Hedl. We'd like to talk about this article of yours, Dan, called Proof of Work is Efficient. So Dan, how you doing today?
Doing well. Thanks for having me on.
You bet, man. Really, really appreciate you taking the time. We know that you're audio only right now, so we're going a little cypherpunk today for those that are watching the live stream. Dan is audio only today, but we got a lot of stuff to talk about, a lot of stuff to share, so I don't think that'll be a problem. So Dan, let's just get it started with maybe tell the audience a little bit about yourself, and maybe after that we'll ask the motivation behind the article. So go ahead and tell everybody a bit about yourself.
Yeah, sounds good. So I got involved in crypto in around 2012, 2013. Moved out to San Francisco January 2013 and started getting involved in the meetups out here. And back in that day, there was only like 15 people at the Bitcoin meetup in San Francisco. And this was at 20 Mission. I don't know if you guys remember Jared Kenna from Trade Hill, but Trade Hill was—
Oh yeah, everybody remembers Trade Hill.
Yeah, one of the first U.S. exchanges. And Jared hosted the meetup at 20 Mission. And so, yeah, back in that day, you had it was like Brian and Fred before they hired Olaf, and Charlie Lee, and there's only, and Jed McCaleb, and it was a really tight knit group. And then March 2013 hit, and the price went to $260, and then all of a sudden it exploded. That's when I started to build products in the space, and that started with ZeroBlock, which was the first real-time market data newsfeed aggregator. We got acquired by blockchain.info later that year. I was the first product manager at Blockchain, and then I went to ChangeTip. ChangeTip ultimately didn't work out, a little too early.
Yeah, that was unfortunate, though. There's a lot of people that wanted that one to work out, but it's just hard with social media and, the micro tipping and, of course, the fees. It was a little bit before its time, I think, like you said.
I think so, too. I think the team was great, and I think it was a beloved product in the space, but, being early is the same as being wrong. So, unfortunately, it didn't work out there. Then went to Uber for 2 years during the cold crypto winter. Saw what the world looked like outside of crypto, and then finally made my way back to my first love, crypto, last year. And so I'm working on a portfolio management tool for institutional traders called Interchange. And that's kind of full circle my end-to-end experience in crypto. And then started writing about a month ago. And started writing because I felt like there were some topics around like Lightning or proof of work, and I've got some more coming out later that had been I felt kind of misrepresented or not covered in a data-driven or rational manner, and I felt kind of compelled to go write about it. So that was kind of the genesis of this article.
Awesome. Yeah, great to hear, man, because this is a really important article, I believe, for the space as a whole, as the crypto space as a whole, as we're all learning together. We need to understand some of these efficiencies, and proof of work being one of the most important parts and functions of Bitcoin. There's just, for all of its importance, there's just not a whole lot of research out there. There's just not a whole lot of work yet. And again, it's partly because it's early days, but also it's just an extremely difficult field, proof of work specifically, and then crypto just in general can go to so many different fields. We have regulators trying to tell us things, we have hedge fund managers trying to tell us things, and it's just difficult to really get through all of the noise and get some signal. And I really like this article, Dan. To me, this displays a lot of data. This really displays a lot of signal, and is a great example, I believe, of signal in the space, trying to get cut through all the bull crap and get right to the information. So excellent job on the article. So really glad that you wrote that. Maybe we can just get right into it then. The first topic. So why don't you go ahead and give us a little bit of an intro to the article itself before we dive into each individual section.
Yeah, so first I'd like to say that, I'm standing on the shoulders of giants. I took a lot of other people's thoughts in this space, and I think my value is in the aggregation and distillation of the narrative. To where, there's, like, as you guys can see in my tweet storm and in the article, there's quite a few people who had the original thought on this, and I merely kind of I strung it all together in what I thought was the most cohesive narrative possible. And really, wanted to start from a base layer of, what's a first principles thinking in terms of how to think about proof of work, and it starts with thermodynamics. Everything is energy. there's no escaping it, and in thermodynamics, no energy is created or destroyed, merely transferred. So whether you're eating a sandwich or walking or talking on your cell phone or mining, those all use energy, just different forms of energy, whether that be caloric intake with food or electricity usage with miners. And so that's the start of this. Really wanted to start at that base layer to talk about, okay, well, what people often forget that everything is energy, and I wanted to kind of call that out and make that really the purpose of the article as a whole is to take public knowledge, which a lot of people knew that proof of work is efficient, but it wasn't common knowledge. And I wanted to make it common knowledge through some very basic first principles thinking and kind of clear, easy to understand examples.
Excellent, excellent. I think that's what you did here as well. It's really interesting that most people don't understand that everything is energy. I mean, we can take this in a philosophical way, but we won't too much. We want to get and stick with the first principles, fundamentals. But it is true that everything in this world is energy. Energy is the universe's fundamental commodity, right? So it is very, very important that we discuss this, I think, and especially as it relates to Bitcoin, because Bitcoin, as a money, of course, is going to consume lots of energy. So we want to dive into a little bit about this, and I just really love that how everything is energy, how you introduce the article like that, because this is absolutely true in every way, shape, or form, philosophically, spiritually, right, and fundamentally, everything we do in society is energy. So that's just really, really great. And again, most people think that proof of work's energy is wasteful, right? So this is why we want to get into this article and dive into this. So very, very great intro. Let's go ahead and go to the first part of the article, which is proof of work. This is where we want to get started. So I'll let you take it from here, Dan. Go ahead.
Yeah. So, mainly, starting with that base layer of that everything is energy, going into the idea of work or producing goods and services being energy or requiring energy, and how that evolved from human beings just working with our hands and crafting tools and using that to leverage our energy, to domesticating animals, and then eventually to creating machines. All of those require energy, and through ourselves or other mechanisms that we've leveraged to accelerate our growth or accelerate our economic output, all of those require energy. And the idea too was that a lot of people don't think of their money as energy, but because goods and services require work, because they require that, essentially money is stored energy. It's the stored, if money is fungible, if my dollar can be used to go buy a Coca-Cola or be used to go buy electricity, technically it can buy any good or service in that economy. It should be worth the same across the entire economy. And because of that, it really is a representation of energy. It's a representation or a good or service that required work, energy and work. It's a representation of that.
Absolutely. I mean, I think you say here in the article that even in the early days, people like Henry Ford and Edison were interested in replacing gold or the dollar with something called the energy dollar, right? The units of energy, an actual commodity over energy currency. So that is really, really interesting. And I really like this quote you put in there by Mark Twain, right? That in order to make a man, woman covet a thing, it is only necessary to make the thing difficult to attain, right? And this is exactly like the very fundamental principles of proof of work. We have to make sure that energy is expended in order to make sure that Bitcoin is, has this base level of value, right? Because everything is energy, so we have to be able to measure that and measure how much everything takes. And as you can see from this graph, for the audio viewers, I am screen sharing the article as always on this Perspective show. We're screen sharing some of these graphics, and you can just see that the energy consumption versus the world and GDP, it always accelerates in a very, very predictable straight line. From 1965 to 2016, we have almost like this just perfect perfect angled line that goes from 20 all the way to 80, right? And when we're talking about GDP in the trillions, 20 trillion to 80 trillion, very, very predictably, and this is not going to slow down. And there's really nothing wrong with this. As a society, we continue to produce more energy over time, and there's really nothing wrong with that. It completely makes sense. We continue to do more things, right? We continue to use our minds more. We continue to build on the ideas of the previous ideas, like you say, Dan, standing on the shoulders of giants with every single new invention, right? It's going to require more energy. So I'll let you take it from here. I just wanted to get a couple of those points. But yeah, this is a great graph.
Yeah, it was really fun going down this rabbit hole of, one, kind of digging in deep on the base level, then like researching energy money. That was really kind of a fun rabbit hole to go down. And then I was really surprised to see how tightly GDP was connected to energy. It was really surprising, actually. I, of course, trying to find points or trying to find data sets that help me make my point. And I was a little bit surprised about how well energy consumption and GDP fit. It was pretty astounding, to be honest. It's actually a almost direct correlation with GDP. Now, of course, that depends on developing nations versus developed nations, and that trends differently over time and through hundreds of years. But overall, there's a pretty tight fit.
Sure. So maybe real quick, you could just give us a quick explanation of proof of work, what it actually does for Bitcoin and other chains.
Yeah, if we want to scroll down a little bit, that's where the proof of work section is.
Oh, yeah, that's right. We're getting to there we go. So there we go. The proof of work section. So here you explain it pretty good in the article, but why don't you go ahead and recap that a little bit for the listeners?
Sure. So proof of work is taking electricity and converting that into hashes, or essentially converting that into guesses. And those guesses those run many guesses. And through that, they eventually find the winning guess that unlocks the block reward. And so it's essentially taking electricity and transmuting that into something that gives you verifiable proof, which is a hash. It's a verifiable proof that you expended the energy to unlock that reward. It's the only provable way of taking physical things, something physical, which is energy, and converting that into the digital world, a hash, and using that to represent something that was done in the physical world, which was the work or the energy required to generate that hash.
Absolutely. That's a great explanation. So again, we use this, in order to prove that energy has been used. And, there's a great addition to this that in Safetyin's book, he makes this point about, the difficulty. The difficulty algorithm in Bitcoin as it relates to the proof of work mining is really, really interesting because unlike any other commodity in the history of mankind, right? When something becomes valuable, we just produce more of it. So for example, so unlike any other thing, in the history, Bitcoin doesn't do this. So when there's a whole lot of, for example, gold is becoming super valuable, people will just produce more gold and then bring the price back down. But with Bitcoin and its difficulty level, as it relates to the proof of work, no matter how much value Bitcoin is worth, no matter how much it is, whether it's $100 or $1 million of Bitcoin, the same amount of Bitcoin will be created every day. The same amount. And that is just really, really powerful and important. And again, unprecedented in human history, to be able to have this commodity that just has this guarantee fixed supply and guarantee creation. So we can absolutely, with perfect precision, predict the the inflation or lack thereof, the deflation as it continues to evolve.
That's right, and I'll actually be getting into that in my next article, which is about absolute scarcity, or about the essentially how the Bitcoin supply curve looks, initial distribution of coins, and digging in a little bit deeper as to how that works. But yeah, you're right. So there is no supply response. That's the commodity term for, with gold, if demand increases, supply also increases. But with Bitcoin, that doesn't occur, which yields the bubble behavior that we see, which is a feature, not a bug.
It's interesting. People don't understand these big bubbles in Bitcoin. They are a feature. Without this, without the way that it works, Bitcoin could just maybe just have a whole lot more volatility, right? And it could have a whole lot more unpredictability when it comes to actually being producing Bitcoin. And it's very, very interesting that because of these properties, they continue to produce Bitcoins very predictable patterns that happens over time. Every time, right? These cycles continue to repeat, these market cycles in Bitcoin every single time, time after time, which is we have this big, huge parabolic blow off, then we correct back down, and we, correct back down for going sideways for 6 to 8 months, maybe a year, and then we start stair stepping up again, and then we have another parabolic blow off and repeat the process, right? This is what Bitcoin has done for the last 10 years, and it can do this because of these very predictable properties. Is that right, Dan?
That's right. And Satoshi was really brilliant in creating the block reward and the distribution as he did, because it's the ultimate K factor, or it's the ultimate viral loop and has a very high K factor. And for the people that don't know what that means, viral loop is something that you see in products in the tech space where, for example, like when you take an Uber, you have the ability to share the Uber app with a friend. And if they end up taking Uber for the first time, you get a free ride and they get a free ride. So that's called a viral loop. And then that person that got a free ride, they might tell their friends about it, and that's how it spreads. And so with Bitcoin, with the 21 million hard cap and a decreasing inflation rate, you have a scenario where people buy in, the price rises, they tell their friends buy in, the price rises, and that's the viral loop. And that K factor, which is the intensity of the virality, is super strong, as we've seen in these boom bust cycles. It's funny because a lot of people like to go, hey, it's not about the price, but it absolutely is about the price. And I touched on this in my first article, which is Hodlers Are the Revolutionaries, where I go into, this was primed for hodlers to hold on to, they buy and hold, and all their friends do, increases the price, attracts more developers, attracts more VC money to go build products in the space. It's a virtuous cycle. And that's where
it's a beautiful feedback loop.
Precisely, that's exactly right. And so it's pretty incredible how this was constructed pretty solidly from the beginning. And essentially,
maybe you could go in a little bit about that, maybe to a little bit of the history, because I believe that you said that the proof of work, was originally conceived to prevent email spam, right? So with like maybe Adam Back's Hashcash and things like that, maybe you could go into a little bit, just a little bit of the brief history of proof of work.
Yeah, I mean, so Adam Back wrote about this a long time ago. Essentially, using a computer would have to prove work or run, use some of its CPU in order to send an email. And the idea would be the tiny amount of electricity expended and time expended to do that would be the user experience on the user side would be somewhat okay. It would only take like a half a second or a second or something to compute that, but that for spammers to send a billion emails, it would take them a super long time to compute all of that. So it was an anti-spam measure. And then later Satoshi adapted that for digital cash.
Absolutely awesome, and again, it was really interesting how the humble beginnings of proof of work and hashing, and of course the beginnings of those start with the public key cryptography, which we won't get into too much here. But again, just another important invention. Everybody's standing on the shoulders of giants, right? Bitcoin's the technology that it has is really many decades old for the most part. Most of the technology in Bitcoin, it's just how it was put together. That was very unique, and what created this unique thing that we call Bitcoin today. You have a couple of interesting points in here. I want to read a couple of these off, and maybe you can comment. You say that Bitcoin is essentially a capitalistic voting mechanism, basically money risked, votes gained. And you say proof of work is about physics more than it really is about code, because, like you say, these energy calculations, right? A little bit more about physics than code itself. And you say Bitcoin is a super commodity minted from energy, the fundamental commodity of the universe. So maybe you could just go a little bit into go into a little bit more detail about those statements there.
Yeah, totally. So around the capitalistic voting mechanism, with votes, typically there's not a lot of risk involved. There's not money involved. there's not money that there is a risk involved in terms of like if your candidate doesn't get voted in, but with Bitcoin, it's a direct representation of risk taken in a way, and that risk taken is very transparent because the only way to take that risk is through buying ASICs, which is CapEx, and then running electricity through them. Of course, there's a few other things as well, which is OpEx. And through that, it's really the incentives for Bitcoin mining have been really well aligned in terms of, you've got an attacker who could launch a 51% attack, or they could, with all the CapEx and OpEx they've already sunk, or mainly CapEx, but ongoing OpEx, they could choose to take the money instead. It's sort of like, yeah, you could try to disrupt the network, but all the money that you put into this, how about you make some money? And so that's really kind of beautiful how Satoshi envisioned that, which was that the reward to behave was higher than the reward to behave poorly. And so
absolutely, that's a real genius, really genius move. Again, using almost human greed against us, like
yes.
for good, using human greed for good, and again, these incentives to be good actors on the network.
Totally. And what's cool is that, this really, there was I'd like to include something that wasn't included in the article. So Tur Demeester and Joe Weisenthal, Joe's over at Bloomberg, and Tur's obviously a well-known crypto economist. They had another one, so another definition of how proof of work transmutes something or changes something, electricity into Bitcoins, or transmutes electricity into digital gold. They had one more that I didn't include, and it'd be nice to call out here, but they talked about alcohol, how alcohol is a way of turning things that rot, like fruit and grain, into something permanent and transportable, wine or whiskey, and how Bitcoin kind of theoretically does the same thing with electricity. And then Tur had a really good example of that, which is on the American frontier back in the Wild West days. Migrating settlers used cattle and whiskey as portable stores of value. And both of those are direct derivatives of solar energy, because the cows eat the grass, and the grass gets its energy from the sun and the soil.
Absolutely. It's pretty profound when you start to think about it like that, when you pull back the different layers and look at the fundamentals, the actual bare metal understandings of some of the physics of some of this energy creation, and again, how efficient Bitcoin converts energy into value. It's absolutely fascinating.
Totally. And one last part before we go on to the other sections, the digital wall example, I think for me was really profound, which is that, Bitcoin's proof of work, it's in the physical world, we have these physical walls that we build around things that are valuable. We put money in vaults, we put our jewels in vaults, we build castles to protect people and goods. And so we know it's intuitive to go build things that protect things in the physical world, and Bitcoin proof of work is building digital walls around our network. And what's cool about proof of work is that the exact energy it required to build the wall is the amount of energy it would take to dismantle the wall, or it's a close approximation. And so I think that's really profound. And a lot of people think, oh, proof of work is inefficient, but it's like, well, if you built a castle wall and it took energy, you wouldn't call that inefficient, because you're trying to protect something. And the idea that, to shame someone for building protection or walls or moats or to protect themselves, shaming them, in the expending of energy to go protect themselves, is kind of silly.
Absolutely. Really like that example. Building digital walls. This is what proof of work essentially does for Bitcoin. And again, to shame somebody for building a wall to protect themselves from inflation, a wall to protect themselves from 1,000 years of abuse of central banking cartels, right? To protect themselves from the purchase regulators at this point, to protect them, for somebody to want to protect their wealth for their children and their children's children, to build walls to protect that, I think is absolutely imperative and important. And it's important that we get this across in this interview and in this article, that building these digital walls is not inefficient. Like you say, if we want to protect something, we have to build a wall around it. And this is what proof of work does. And it does it more efficiently than any other wall that we've ever built in human history.
And it's not just efficiently, it's a noble cause. We built a world that ran on trust, and with crypto, we don't have to trust anyone, and especially with Bitcoin. And so that I think is pretty profound in terms of the energy required to build this digital wall. The benefits from the digital wall are huge.
Absolutely. And remember, guys, the Bitcoin ledger can only be immutable, right? We can only have this immutability, this protection, the censorship resistance, if the Bitcoin itself is costly to produce, if we actually do have these energy walls. Otherwise, people will just break it down, right? And so this is again a really important analogy and a profound analogy as well, I believe. So I think we can move on to the next section. Then with that, the next section is going to be the energy consumption. So this is where we start to really get into some of the math. Why don't you go ahead and break this down for us, Dan?
Yeah, so this was kind of the article that kicked off a firestorm of negative press around proof of work. This is where the silly analogy of hey, let's look at the amount of electricity used in proof of work, Bitcoin's proof of work, versus countries, which is not a not a comparison that's relative at all. So this was all part of the same article by Alex, but his touched on a few things. One, the amount of electricity that Bitcoin's proof of work uses. And then as well, he touched on a KPI that he created to determine efficiency, which was the electricity consumption per transaction, which was really misleading, and also showed that he didn't really understand a lot about how the Bitcoin network works. A couple examples of why this is kind of silly. The energy spent per block the energy spent is per block, which can have a varying number of transactions. So more transactions does not mean more energy. The base layer, layer 1, is constantly being improved, as like Schnorr signatures, which reduces on-chain transactions 25% in size. And then you've got exponential efficiency when you add layers, like Lightning. So with Lightning, you just need 2 on-chain transactions, and then when you have that channel open, you can have hundreds of thousands or millions of transactions within whatever time period you have the channel open for. So when we look at the electricity in the future, you would have to include all of those transactions that are happening on Lightning as well. So it was just a really poor example of a KPI to choose to kind of measure the effectiveness of the energy consumption with proof of work.
Yes, that's a very, very good point. Just to recap that, guys, look, the average cost per transaction is not an adequate metric for measuring the efficiency of Bitcoin's proof of work, right? The economic density of a Bitcoin transaction is always increasing. Like you mentioned, with batching, SegWit, Lightning, additional layers, we're literally going to continuously create orders of magnitude more efficiency when it comes to creating more and more transactions. So that means more and more transactions for the same amount of energy used. So to tie those two as a one-to-one makes absolutely zero sense to me in the world. And this is, again, what that other article was focusing on, and what kind of scared people a little bit.
Yeah, and you hear a lot of in the final way, what was really nice is before I published this, Laurent had some really great articles on proof of work from a much more analytical side than I have. He's a really brilliant guy and kind of came up with some new KPIs to evaluate the cost of proof of work and how it relates to the Bitcoin network. And felt like his example of gravity was really profound, which was that the energy used to secure the chain is distributed or influences all blocks. And I think we've heard a lot of examples like this before. He uses gravity. I've heard other people, like I think Hugh. He's mentioned that it's kind of like attaching weights to blocks, and that those weights decay over time. Other people have talked about it in terms of layers of amber, which is, I think Andreas used that example. So you have to think about it not just in those transactions in that block, but the entire chain. It influences the entire chain.
Absolutely. Maybe you do a little bit of a comparison of aluminum on here. Maybe you can talk a little bit briefly about that.
Yeah, so the aluminum one was kind of fun. I started, so Nick Carter and I both kind of ended up, it's funny, we were both in a chat room, and he posted a link to the same article from 1979 that I had found. And
Great minds think alike, sir.
yeah, we both kind of stumbled upon the same thing at once, and yeah, so I spent a little bit of time looking into aluminum manufacturing, and really it's funny how the high energy usage really mimics sort of the distribution of Bitcoin miners in terms of like aluminum smelting with Bitcoin miners. The huge electricity requirements unlocks that efficiency in these countries that have stranded energy resources like Iceland. And there was actually a quote that they had. The aluminum was a popular means of exporting. That link links to an article where they're directly quoted as to saying, you know, we we import bauxite and then we export aluminum. Essentially, we export electricity. So exporting aluminum in the form of electricity, or exporting electricity in the form of aluminum, which was pretty profound because that is essentially what Bitcoin is doing. Bitcoin mining is doing, where these miners can be allocated to areas that have or disparate energy sources, or sources where they're disconnected from the rest of the world, like Iceland, and take full advantage of those untapped or those stranded resources.
Yeah, that's a really great point, because I think that this is going to be huge for the world. Proof of work is going to create efficiencies around the world when it comes to energy. And this is just an absolutely great example. We saw in China already, we saw sort of some of the miners taking advantage of some of the government subsidy to use some of the overflowing energy in some of those rural plants. And of course, the government didn't like that too much. So of course, people had to move out. But this is just an example of what can happen. And this will continue. This is not going to stop or slow down, right? So we know that proof of work is becoming more efficient over time, and there will be more and more places around the world that people will find renewable energy to use with Bitcoin, right? So a couple of things I want you to go into a little bit, but I just want to mention again that the amount of efficiencies that the proof of work can create for overflow of energy is just absolutely hugely profound. We're talking there's overflow from almost every kind of energy you can think of, from nuclear, from water, from hydro, from sun, from just about anything, and the ability to just have that ability to just convert energy, in real time to value, to Bitcoin is profound, and again, never really existed before, at least at this efficient of a level. So maybe you can just tell us a little bit quickly or briefly how Bitcoin is continuing to become more efficient, or sorry, that proof of work is becoming more efficient, and maybe how it can even lead to better renewable energy.
Yeah. I mean, and the way to think about efficiency is that the rate of efficiency with ASICs is slowing down. They're not, if you want to scroll up, I think there's a great chart that shows that, where it shows the difficult, scroll up a little bit. Yeah, it shows the difficult, a little bit more. There we go. Yeah, it shows the mining difficulty and then the different types of miners that have existed since the dawn of Bitcoin. And it shows how we see that kind of that rate slowing down. Eventually, we're going to have physics restraint to where ASICs won't be able to become that much more efficient, and really all the costs shift to being OpEx, which is just the cost of electricity. So that's where I kind of put my frame of mind, was in that future state where all of the costs are primarily electricity. The miners have been optimized for durability and longevity. How do we think about that? And it's really about finding the cheapest electricity possible. And that's where it gets really interesting because of that hunt for cheap electricity. It's sort of like the same thing happened with aluminum. Aluminum manufacturers, they went all across the world to scout. They scoured the world, as that 1979 article said. They scoured the world for cheap electricity, and the Bitcoin mining will do the same thing. Proof of work will stimulate that hunt, that endless search for the cheapest electricity possible.
Amazing stuff, guys. When the only cost left is energy, you can bet that there's going to be efficiencies driven in there. And I really like the quote you put in there from Nick Carter, of course, right? This global energy, he says, this global energy net liberates stranded assets and makes new ones viable. So here we go. So I should put this as the beginning. This is the beginning of the quote. Imagine a 3D topographic map of the world, with cheap energy hotspots being lower and expensive energy being higher. He says, I imagine Bitcoin mining being akin to a glass of water being poured over the surface, settling in the nooks and crannies and smoothing out eventually. So this is, again, just a great visual analogy of how Bitcoin, how it's going to find efficiency. It's going to absolutely gravitate and navigate towards wherever the efficiency is and energy. And when we're done, with getting efficiencies from that, we'll create more efficiencies and on and on. I think you even mentioned fusion reactors eventually.
Yeah.
Is that right?
Before we get to that, one quick call out that didn't make it into the article. There's something that Bitcoin mining, I believe, hasn't done yet. And I reached out to one of my mining buddies to go ask him, about this. There's something called combined heat and power. And combined heat and power is recycling the waste heat from the mining operation and recycling that back into energy generation. So for example, Bitcoin miners, their primary output is hashes and heat. And so most miners are not recycling the heat. In fact, the cooling it requires energy. Instead of them harnessing the excess heat, they're instead expending more energy to cool it down. In the future, they could build, there's a lot of different power plants have this built in, where they harness that waste heat that occurs during the electricity generation process, and then they bring that back into the electricity generating process. So taking that heat and recycling it.
Amazing. That seems like the next step because, like you say, there's just huge amounts of heat output. That is one of the main outputs of Bitcoin mining. So to be able to put that to good use, it's completely makes sense. I mean, we're going to have Bitcoin heaters, right, Dan? That everybody can buy Bitcoin mining heaters. Is that the future?
Maybe. I'm not sure if retail mining makes sense, but it's certainly a cool thought experiment.
Yeah, I'm not sure how much sense it makes either. Maybe we should go back in time until 21.
that chart right at the top there, the hash rate cost dollars per gigahash. That's a great example. Yeah, right. Oh, you had it right there, right in the middle. Yeah, that's a great example of how that's trended really cheaply over time, where we're seeing, essentially the dollar value per hash drop exponentially over time. That will continue to drop.
Yes, and so that again continues to prove that Bitcoin's proof of work gets more efficient over time.
That's right.
Very, very cool. All right, cool. So maybe you can tell us a little bit about the fusion reactors. You did put that in the article, so I thought maybe just a quick brief summary of that.
Yeah, we can. This is where it got kind of fun, and I'm the first one to admit this goes this gets a little bit it gets kind of fun. It's more thinking about, okay, well, if we really look on a far horizon, and let's say my assumptions are correct, and let's say that Bitcoin's proof of work really incentivizes that hunt for cheap electricity. I started to think about, okay, well, what are those level step leaps forward in humanity where we unlock new energy that is super cheap, and fission is one of those nuclear reactors. And the hunt for a fusion reactor has been a long, arduous process. A lot of the funding is public, so it's funded by governments. And as we know, governments don't allocate money that effectively. They're not incentivized by profit, so therefore the individuals and the capital allocation hasn't been allocated properly. And I think, I hypothesize and I hope that the possibility to unlock that cheaper electricity, that Bitcoin mining, if Bitcoin mining becomes even a bigger industry, say Bitcoin's market cap rises another 10x or 100x, then Bitcoin mining, the amount expended every year, might actually be enough to for them to spend a fraction of that on R&D to go build out a fusion reactor. And like I said, I caveated that with a lot of assumptions and everything else, but I think that's a plausible scenario in the future where you've got mining companies that are worth $100 billion and they want to go spend $3 to $5 billion a year on researching fusion because that would lower their electricity costs. So, I don't think it's that crazy of an assumption, but it's something that not a lot of people have thought about, and I think it certainly will help and not hurt the race towards fusion.
Absolutely. I mean, that's just a huge win for the world for energy, is fusion. And what better incentive to drive humanity there than Bitcoin, right? I mean, there is no better incentive to drive humanity to more efficient energy consumption than Bitcoin. There's just never has been. We've always tried to make strides, but this is going to be the absolute, order of magnitude type of increase, I think, in energy. I think if we're going to look back, we're going to probably, over the next few decades, like you say, I think. Oh, we'll get to that. We'll get to that later. But I was about to mention the type 1 civilization stuff, but no, we'll get to that later. But it's just going to. There's just no other way, I think, to get us to the efficiency that we need, because we are nowhere near what we need to be. There is many, 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 much more efficiency that we can create and carve out, and Bitcoin is going to give us those incentives. So I think we can. Let me just close out this section with a statement that you made from the article here. It says Bitcoin's proof of work is the buyer of last resort for all electricity, creating a floor that incentivizes the building of new energy, producing plants around the disparate energy sources that would have otherwise been left untapped. So really, really great quote. And I think that makes a whole lot of sense. So let's move on then to the next section, which is the relative costs. Maybe you can go ahead and introduce us into that.
Yeah, this one was fun. This, I heavily leveraged a lot of research in the space on this. Some people went really far down the rabbit hole in terms of calculating gold mining costs and gold recycling and all of that. And so I leveraged a lot of these different research papers that were done on this to pull this together. But essentially, if we're going to look at the relative energy usage, well, we should look at relevant comps to Bitcoin. Like to say Bitcoin uses as much electricity as Austria is absurd, because that is no relation to the financial system or gold mining or anything that's equivalent to what Bitcoin does. And that's where I had a tweet storm after this where I was a little bit sarcastic, and I had like a little alarms in a title that said "Electricity Police," and called out some common wastes of electricity like Xboxes and PS4s, and you don't hear anyone shaming someone for using their Xbox because it uses electricity.
What about Christmas lights, man? We have to shame the Christmas lights users.
Christmas lights. Oh yeah, I mean, how about brunch or
speaking of this real quick, Charlie Lee or somebody, I think, just tweeted out the other day in the Twitter sphere, like there was this ATM machine that was made of pure LCDs. This big, huge ATM machine goes to the ceiling, to the floor, and 3 sides of it were just pure LCDs, and just from every single pixel covered. And it's like for an ATM machine. And of course, the whole point was to have a pretty picture, a pretty video to draw you into their ATM.
Yeah, and the way that I'm phrasing this is that it's electricity policing or electricity shaming, and I think that's really nonsensical, because we don't do that. Well, we do have that a little bit. People are like, "Hey, turn off the lights. You don't want to waste electricity," and I think we're all conscious that we want to be as efficient as possible. But I certainly think the ROI with the electricity used for the Bitcoin proof of work is totally worth it, and that's where I wanted to call this out and use realistic comparisons to what it should be compared against, instead of something completely arbitrary like a country. You could say, Bitcoin uses as much electricity as 1,000 747s. Well, it's a silly analogy. It's not.
It's completely different use cases. It's really ridiculous. It's almost like saying, "Hey, look, my castle is 3 times the size of your castle." Haha. Like what? It's no relevance on anything. Yeah.
Yeah. It's not being data driven. It's purely using vanity metrics, and I find that it's a little bit, I think, unethical, because that's not at all. That's just using poor data to get your point across, rather than being as truth-seeking as possible. And that's where I wanted to be here. Of course, I'm sure there are some things that have been miscalculated here. Obviously, these are general calculations.
Let's read Safe's quote real quick, because this is a good transition after that. Yeah. Dan put this great quote by Safe in here from his book, The Bitcoin Standard. It says, if people find that electricity worth paying for, if people find that electricity worth paying for, the electricity has not been wasted, right? If people find the electricity that they're using useful, and they want to pay for it, then it's not wasted. They found it useful. And those who expend this electricity are rewarded with the Bitcoin currency. So if people choose to mine and they get rewarded and it's benefiting them, then that is not a waste.
And those miners didn't steal the electricity. They paid market rate for it.
Absolutely.
It's like how,
or at least for the most part, that we know of, you're not going to get a very large mining operation if you're stealing electricity. I assure you, it won't grow. It's very big.
Right. Yeah. And of course they negotiate something cheaper because they this is what, aluminum, the aluminum industry does as well. They negotiate a little bit cheaper rates, but, they pay market rate for as much as they're consuming. Right. And that's where it's so silly. It's not like these miners are going out and tapping into the into the grid and just stealing electricity.
Absolutely. This is just like somebody like shaming somebody for creating wood, right? For creating panels for like Home Depot. It's people need this product, and so somebody's going to manufacture it, right?
I mean, just think about how much electricity is used taking selfies, right? Like the amount of electricity used taking selfies. Not only the electricity to keep the phone charged for the duration of the selfie, but all the energy required to build the app that took the selfie, including the offices and the individuals who work there, all the money, all the capital required to build the app that enabled the selfie, and then all of the energy required to raise your arm up. That's it requires calories.
What about the satellites? We haven't even gotten to the connectivity parts of it, right?
Yeah, and then the other components of the cell phone. The cell phone required energy to be created. The cell phone towers, the satellite, satellites for GPS, cell phone towers for internet connectivity, and then you've got
we can go down a rabbit hole. It's true, and this is what we're trying to point out to the viewers: is that going down these rabbit holes makes no sense when there is proven utility, and proven efficiency coming out of a manufacturing process.
Precisely. And like the ROI, and that's where I really call it at the end, and we'll get into that in a second here, but the ROI is just so huge that it's sort of nonsensical to even criticize this.
Absolutely. So we got about 10 minutes left or so I think we can cover that, cover the rest of it. So is there anything else for this particular section for the relative costs?
Yeah, well, I struggled a little bit on the government's one. I thought about just using military because a lot of people like to say, fiat currency is backed by guns, and which I think is an absurd thing to say anyways. It's not like the citizens of Argentina are forced at gunpoint to go use pesos.
I mean, we do hear that statement all the time, and it does get old because it just breaks down really, really, really quickly.
Totally. And so governments was a tough one. That government's line, the government's row I was thinking about calling that military. In the U.S. military, energy costs and budget was easy to calculate, but I think globally it was a little bit trickier. But then I was like, well, the political machina is part of this as well. I can't just divorce out the banking system and paper currency and minting and military. Like politics plays into this as well. So I decided to lump military and politics under governments, just to kind of clarify that a little bit. But it was mainly around, and that's a pretty big ballpark estimate. These numbers are pretty hard to calculate, but I think they're directionally accurate.
Yep. And what we can see here, of course, is that Bitcoin is far more efficient than traditional systems like the banking system and the government, which, is just insane amounts of waste and electricity that goes into there.
Yeah, people forget, they're like you highlighted that ATM with LED lights on it. Well, think about every ATM in the world and every retail bank branch and all the people in the retail bank branches and all the air conditioning that they use and all the food that they eat.
I try to remind people of this, of all of the towering banking buildings around the world and major cities. Just, one single building, billions of dollars to produce.
Exactly. Yeah. To produce, and then the continuing OpEx, the continuing operation of that requires a ton of energy as well.
Absolutely.
So yeah, just this really highlighted, I think this was like the clearest way I could make my point, which was that compared to all these other monetary systems or stores of value, that Bitcoin was relatively efficient.
Absolutely. So this is great. I just want to close out this one with a statement again from you. It says, Bitcoin's utilization of the excess electricity capacity consumes magnitudes less electricity than the existing fiat systems. And of course, we can just look to pretty much anywhere in the traditional fiat systems to find inefficiencies. It is abound. So I think we can close out that section. We have one final section for this article, which is the Type 1 civilization. For me, this was, the most fun. It gets into a little bit of the sci-fi stuff. So I really like it. Why don't you go ahead and tell us about this, Dan?
Yeah, well, I'm a sci-fi enthusiast. Like it's funny. So when I was at Uber, the fifth floor of Uber, all of the conference rooms were named after sci-fi novels or characters in novels,
Nice.
which is really, really cool. And the fifth floor looked kind of spaceshipy too. It had like LED lights and black paneling and stuff. But I early on, my uncle got me into the Foundation series by Isaac Asimov. And so I've always been fascinated with humanity moving beyond this planet and moving into the stars. And so I had been jamming with a buddy, Eric Martindale. He was over formerly at Blockstream. Now he's working on layer 3 Bitcoin stuff called Fabric. And him and I were talking about this. And right now we're a type 1. We're moving from a type 0 to a type 1 civilization, both in language, economy, and energy. And my hypothesis, or my kind of I put this out to the world, that Bitcoin mining might push us faster towards becoming a type 1 energy civilization. Right now we're at a 0.72, and people had hypothesized that this would take 100 to 200 years, but maybe with that literal stimulus of Bitcoin's proof of work, that might accelerate that rate of growth, and we might see that within our lifetime, which unlocks some really profound things. One, this chart's a great example that energy consumption and per capita GDP go hand in hand. Essentially, we found this really tight correlation with the amount of electricity used in terms of standard of living. That people's standard of living goes up when they have more access to electricity. And I think that is intuitive, right? And sorry, I meant to say their access to energy as a whole. But you've got all these different processes that require energy, and the cheaper and more available that energy is, the more things they can do with it, from running their dishwasher to using a cell phone to being able to turn on the light or watch a TV. So I think that this is the push to find cheaper and cheaper electricity will overall push humanity forward into becoming a more prosperous place for everyone.
Absolutely. I mean, access to more electricity, more energy for more people at a more efficient rate is going to, again, push us to a type 1 civilization, right? Push us to that golden age. I think that a lot of people, are believe that is coming, right? Maybe the singularity is another example of this. Just the culmination of all the technologies together, like Bitcoin, artificial intelligence, and so on. The information technology. This is what's going to push us, I think, to the type 1 civilization. But we couldn't do it without Bitcoin. We still need Bitcoin, and like you say, maybe we could do it without Bitcoin, but with Bitcoin, I think that you're right in saying that we could push this forward by hundreds of years. We could reach the type 1 civilization hundreds of years before without it.
Yeah, Bitcoin merely bends the rate of acceleration. It probably would have happened without it, but this accelerates that, which is really, really profound. And I think people are wondering, okay, cool. Well, you've got your sci-fi definition of a type 1 civilization, but what does that mean for me? And I highlighted an example, which is that through fusion or really, really cheap electricity sources, there's an example of what we can use with that, which is desalination. So we can take seawater and convert that into fresh water. And right now, that's a really energy intensive process and doesn't make sense in terms of cost. But with these cheaper electricity sources, we may unlock that for the world, which would be huge. We solve issues around farming where they don't have access to a lot of fresh water. This could solve a ton of problems where a lot of people have hypothesized we're going to see water wars in the future as we use up all this fresh water that we have, that resource is going to be fought over or cause strife. And I think this is a great example of, with that cheaper electricity, now it becomes trivial to convert seawater into fresh water. And that solves a problem that, if you plot on a linear path, looked like it was this inevitable issue that humanity was going to have to deal with. And because of how exponential curves work, exponential improvements in electricity efficiency, we unlock these greater things for humanity.
Absolutely. This desalinization is an amazing example of what the unlocking new energy efficiencies can do. And it's just one of these examples that are so profound. Like, we're literally saying that, that Bitcoin could lead to efficiencies that could have us have unlimited water for the rest of our civilization. Like, that's huge. I mean, this is some of the things that Bitcoin could lead to. It's so profound that it almost goes into sci-fi territory. You have to take a step back. But look, just look at the economics. This is what's going to happen. This finite supply, this incentive, find efficient energy, all of this together. It's not any one thing. It's all of the things together that combine to create these network effects that continue to push Bitcoin further and further into the stratosphere. One network effect after another, financialization, one after another. I think that this is going to be a great example that we can, again, push for efficiencies and use for the future of humanity to build these civilizations, to build these golden ages, to build the singularity, to actually get there and become finally a type 1 civilization. So just great points, Dan. Great article. Let me just end this with just quote from you here, and then I'll let you, I'll just give you the floor after that real quick. So you say, is the trustless settlement of $1.34 trillion between counterparties annually, with the added benefit of cheaper energy for all, worth the $4.5 billion in current mining costs? Well, I think the answer is a resounding yes. And I will definitely agree with you there, Dan. So I just want to thank you so much again for coming on the show, man. We really, really appreciate it. We had a great time. A lot of people in the chat, a lot of people tuning in. And of course, if you guys missed the show, it always is on our YouTube channel at cryptocast.network. So Dan, to close us out, why don't you just give us just the floor is yours. Tell us what you want to summarize, and then tell us where we can find out more about you.
Yeah. So, thanks for having me on again, and I hope everyone enjoyed the show. To find more about me, I would just follow me on Twitter. It's Dan Held. Actually, I use my real name. And by the way, Held is my real name, guys. It's not it's not a crypto pun.
It's a real name, guys.
It's a real name. Now, of course, I make it kind of cutesy on Twitter. I call it Hedl. Which of course I'd have to, given I'm in the crypto space.
Of course.
But yeah, I'd say I'd leave with one thing, one final thing, which is that my article coming out next week is called Absolute Scarcity. And this is covering the 21 million hard cap, covering the distribution of coins. And I think the key takeaway here is that absolute scarcity brings abundance. And that's the hunt for electricity, the 21 million hard cap, all of those incentives, through that hunt, through that scarcity artificially created, we will unlock greater abundance in the world.
It's funny. Some of that stuff is counterintuitive, right? You're telling me a limited supply, limiting something will allow us to create more abundance, but that's what's up. That is the sound money principle. That is what we've seen in the course of the history of mankind. We've seen, humanity start to excel when we have times of sound money, like with gold and with Bitcoin. I think we're going to have a whole new golden age.
Absolutely.
Awesome, Dan. Well, thanks so much again, man, for joining us. We're gonna probably have to get you back for that new article, man. We'll probably have to do another episode. I really love doing these perspectives. Again, the show was Perspective on the CryptoCast Network, to be able to give authors the ability to explain their article in their own words and in an audio format, and again, add additional detail that maybe they couldn't get a chance to add beforehand. So thanks again, Dan. We really appreciate you coming on the show. You guys can find the links to Dan and his articles all in the show notes, as always. And of course, you can find me on Twitter at @the1vortex. And again, guys, if you are new to the channel, please hit that subscribe button. We really appreciate it. Hit the thumbs up if you guys like the show. And if you are an audio listener, please give us a review on iTunes. We would really appreciate it. So until next time, guys, please keep talking Bitcoin, and we'll see you later. Bye-bye.
Yeah.